Welcome to another deep dive. This is an episode of the podcast series The Riffle, brought to you by 10 Leaves. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on something that, well, it might sound like it's straight out of a spy novel, but it's very real. And it poses this fundamental threat to global security. We're talking about the, let's say, shadowy world of proliferation financing. Basically, how illicit actors often operating right under our noses manage to fund WMD development, weapons of mass destruction, and, importantly, how they expertly evade the global sanctions that are actually meant to stop them.
It's definitely a complex area, and it's constantly shifting. What's truly fascinating, I think, is how the latest intelligence gives us this fresh snapshot of these, well, rapidly evolving schemes. It's really about understanding not just what these actors are doing, but why their methods are such a huge challenge to the whole international financial system.
Absolutely. And our main source for this deep dive is a pretty critical report from the Financial Action Task Force, FATF. It came out in June 2025 called Complex Proliferation Financing and Sanctions Evasion Schemes. Now, for those who might not know, FATF is this independent intergovernmental body. They're kind of the global standard setter in fighting money laundering, terrorist financing, and crucially for us today, WMD proliferation financing, often just called PF.
Right. And the report's purpose really is to lay bare the methods and trends that both state and non-state actors use. They want to show how these groups get around proliferation-related sanctions, whether that's, under specific FATF guidelines like Recommendation 7 that targets UN-sanctioned entities like, say, North Korea, or just broader national and international sanctions that different countries put in place.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. This isn't just about some obscure financial rules, is it? It's really about global security and, frankly, how incredibly clever these illicit actors are at hiding their financial tracks. So our mission for you, the listener, is to give you a clear shortcut, sort of, to understanding these pretty sophisticated threats, identifying the sometimes surprising tactics they use, and just grasping why this all matters to you, whether you're in finance, policy, or honestly just curious about global stuff.
Precisely. It's about getting that deeper insight into the mechanisms that let WMD proliferation keep going, and crucially, how that knowledge can be used to maybe proactively counter these schemes instead of always, playing catch-up.
Right. With that in mind, let's dive into what the report calls the evolving threat landscape. First off, how does the report actually define WMD proliferation and proliferation financing? What am I talking about here?
Okay, so WMD proliferation is defined as the manufacture, acquisition, possession, development, export, or transfer of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons and their delivery systems. It also includes something called dual-use goods. These are items, with legitimate commercial uses that can easily be repurposed for WMD programs. Think certain chemicals or maybe high-precision machinery. And PF proliferation financing is, well, simply the act of raising, moving, or making available funds, assets, or economic resources for these WMD proliferation purposes.
In a scale, the report suggests it's huge, right? Actors like the DPRK in North Korea generating billions.
Yes, billions. The DPRK really stands out as the most significant actor here. I mean, despite facing UN sanctions since way back in 2006, they just continue to advance their WMD capabilities. We saw that pretty starkly with their 11th ICBM launch, the Hwasong 19, that was October 2024.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. Almost 2 decades of sanctions. And the DPRK isn't just like surviving. They're diversifying their revenue streams in ways you might never, ever expect. It's almost a masterclass in exploiting global blind spots.
It really is. Take cyber attacks. They've been incredibly lucrative for them. The report mentions they stole an estimated $1.5 billion from Bybit just in February 2025. And the total value from suspected cyber attacks between 2017 and 2023, around $3 billion. They specifically target virtual asset companies.
Wow. That's just a mind-boggling amount of money. But it's not only high-tech cybercrime, is it? The report talks about them leveraging more, let's say, traditional avenues, too, like IT workers.
Absolutely. They generate significant cash through literally thousands of highly skilled IT workers deployed across the globe. These individuals often use false identities, get paid using virtual assets. It makes tracing the funds back to the DPRK incredibly difficult. It's like this huge distributed network of covert labor.
And maybe the most surprising one, wigs and false eyelashes. That just sounds surreal.
It does, doesn't it? But it's such a stark illustration of their adaptability. In early 2024, these products apparently accounted for nearly 60% of DPRK exports to a neighboring country. And the report explicitly links this seemingly harmless trade back to UN-sanctioned entities. So the revenue, it suggests, directly supports their WMD program. They exploit consumer goods markets just as easily as financial systems, it seems.
So high-tech cybercrime, beauty products, even illegal wildlife trade in sub-Saharan Africa is mentioned. The sheer breadth is alarming.
It shows they'll engage in pretty much any low-risk, high-reward activity to get funds. What's also quite concerning is the DPRK's increasing financial connectivity. That DPRK-Russia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty from late 2024, it's strengthening economic and banking ties. This has apparently already facilitated transactions worth hundreds of millions, even though UN sanctions require countries to expel DPRK bankers. Over 50 were still operating mid-2024.
Okay, shifting focus a bit. Iran is another major player mentioned. They aren't currently under UN proliferation sanctions anymore. That sunsetted in October 2023, but many countries still have their own national sanctions, right?
That's correct. Iran often relies on militarized proxies like Hezbollah and various transnational criminal groups to get around sanctions. They're heavily involved in things like oil smuggling, weapons trafficking, and extensive money laundering, often using foreign exchange houses. Hezbollah, in particular, is seen as a dominant force in global money laundering, procuring weapons for Iran against sanctions.
And the Russian Federation, it's viewed as a proliferation financing threat, kind of by extension, because of these deepening ties with the DPRK.
Exactly. Especially following that comprehensive strategic partnership treaty, the report even notes confirmed deployment of DPRK soldiers in the Russia-Ukraine conflict back in April 2025. It just highlights how interconnected these threats really are.
And beyond these big state actors, the report touches on non-state actors too, like terrorist groups.
Yes, there's this persistent concern about terrorist groups, criminal organizations maybe acquiring WMD knowledge or tech. A key UN resolution, UNSCR 1540, flags this risk, although financial exploitation examples involving non-state actors are fewer in the report.
So if you connect all these dots.
Well, you see this dynamic shift, right? State actors are adapting, they're leveraging these huge global networks. Meanwhile, non-state actors, they represent this persistent, though maybe less documented, risk. But the potential impact if they did get WMD capabilities means, constant vigilance is absolutely vital.
Okay, so understanding this shifting threat, how do these actors actually manage to operate? It seems to boil down to exploiting vulnerabilities in the global system. Let's dig into that. Exploiting vulnerabilities, starting maybe at the national level.
Right. A critical factor is just a country's basic economic and trade setup. Think international financial centers, their open economies, massive fund flows, their prime targets. Also, countries with strategic ports or major logistics hubs are vulnerable, especially as potential choke points for those dual-use goods we mentioned. And of course, nations that have, let's say, significant economic or geopolitical ties with sanctioned countries can maybe inadvertently create openings for evasion.
And regulation-wise, I get the sense there are still pretty big gaps globally.
Oh, definitely. While there's been progress on anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, the global rollout of counter-proliferation financing, or CPF measures, it just lags behind. The report notes that 84% of countries show only moderate to low effectiveness in implementing the relevant standards. This includes things like weak national laws on beneficial ownership transparency, which, makes it incredibly hard to trace who really owns the funds and assets, obscuring those PF pathways.
So even if the rules exist on paper, if they're not enforced effectively, big loopholes.
Right.
And geography matters too.
Hugely. Just being close to sanctioned countries, being near vital shipping lanes, even the presence of diplomatic personnel who might exploit immunity, these can all create pathways. Like, how countries in East Asia might be exposed to these roundabout financial dealings originating from the DPRK.
Okay, beyond these national factors, how do specific industries or sectors get pulled in?
Well, the banking and financial sectors are naturally major targets. Illicit actors exploit really fundamental processes using multiple accounts, falsifying documents, manipulating trade finance. Correspondent banking relationships are particularly tricky because banks often lack direct visibility into their customer's customer. Wire transfers, while fast, often carry limited information, making them easier to misuse. And just having extensive banking networks and easy access doesn't help either.
And then we have the newer frontiers like virtual assets, Bitcoin, crypto, and the companies that handle them, the VASPs.
Yeah.
That seems like a major worry.
Oh, it certainly is. There's a definite increase in reliance on virtual assets for payments and transfers by these actors. And this is made worse by this, pervasive lack of effective AML-CFT-CPF measures for these VASPs globally. As of April 2024, the report says three-quarters, 75% of countries in the FATF global network were either non-compliant or only partially compliant with the recommendations for virtual assets. That just lets illicit actors easily use things like mixing services or anonymity-enhancing coins to hide their tracks.
And are they looking beyond traditional systems like SWIFT, too, for payments?
Yes, they're actively exploring channels like peer-to-peer services, digital remittance providers, basically trying to bypass systems that have stronger controls. And outside finance, you've got sectors like trust and company service providers, dealers in precious metals and stones, aeronautics, IT, maritime, nuclear power, shipbuilding. They're all vulnerable, often because of their connection to dual-use goods.
This really raises a crucial question, doesn't it? How can we shift from always being reactive, chasing these actors, to being more proactive? It seems like it requires understanding these systemic weaknesses before they get fully exploited.
Exactly. It demands a much more comprehensive, forward-looking approach to assessing risk. It really means trying to anticipate the next move, not just reacting to the last one.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty then. The four main ways these actors are actually using these vulnerabilities. This brings us to the four major typologies, the report's breakdown of how these complex schemes work.
Right. The report highlights four main methods. First, enlisting intermediaries to evade sanctions. Second, obscuring beneficial ownership information. Third, using virtual assets and other technologies. And fourth, exploiting the maritime and shipping sectors.
All right, let's start with typology 1, enlisting intermediaries. Sounds like just adding layers to hide the truth.
That's pretty much it. They rely heavily on front companies, shell companies, anything to mask the true origin, destination, or purpose of funds and goods. For example, Australian authorities back in 2021 found a citizen using offshore accounts and Aussie-based front companies to broker illegal trade with the DPRK. We're talking coal, graphite, oil, even missile components. Similarly, in the U.S., early 2024, some Chinese nationals were charged with using front companies in China and Hong Kong to smuggle U.S.-origin electronic parts to Iran's military for drones and missiles. It's all about creating a smokescreen with layers of seemingly legit businesses.
And they also exploit global supply chains using transit points in third countries.
Absolutely. They use things like free trade zones, ship goods through multiple ports, anything to deliberately muddy the waters about the true origin or destination. There was a case in France where an Iranian company tried getting composite materials from a French supplier but routed it through a third country company run by another Iranian, just to hide the real end user. The sheer complexity of global logistics becomes their cover.
And all this is kind of underpinned by clever use of bank accounts and financing through these third countries as well.
They layer transactions, route payments through loads of different banks, especially in places with, shall we say, weaker sanctions enforcement. We've seen repeated examples, like in the UAE, where shipping companies used forged documents to sell oil to a terrorist group, then funneled the money through front companies. Or that huge shadow banking network busted by the U.S. for Iran's military, using exchange houses and front companies in Hong Kong and the UAE to launder oil money and buy weapons parts.
Okay, moving to typology 2. Obscuring beneficial ownership information, BOI, hiding who's really pulling the strings.
Exactly. The DPRK, for instance, often uses foreign-based front and shell companies, covert overseas reps, even foreign nationals as third-party facilitators. It all helps obscure who the real beneficial owner is. There was a big U.S. case, September 2024, where a network in Russia and South Ossetia got designated for using these illicit schemes, banks, companies to help the DPRK's foreign trade bank access the international financial system, directly violating bans on correspondent banking.
And they get quite creative with the types of legal entities they use, too.
They do. Subsidiaries, opaque corporate structures, complex setups designed purely to hide ownership. An EU case showed how a sanctioned person used someone else in a subsidiary company to buy shares in a frozen entity, basically unfreezing the assets indirectly. Or in Germany, shell companies hid the true owner of luxury cars, later proven to be controlled by someone on the EU's Russia sanctions list. It's just creating these webs of corporate disguise.
Right, this next one is definitely one for the aha moments. How new tech, meant to simplify things, gets twisted. Typology 3, using virtual assets and other technologies.
Yeah, a major challenge here is just the regulatory environment. Many virtual asset service providers, or VASPs, simply lack robust AML-CFT requirements. Remember that figure. As of April 2024, three-quarters of countries in the FATF network were non-compliant or only partially compliant with the virtual asset recommendations. That creates massive holes for illicit actors.
Like that big Binance enforcement action last year? That must be related.
Exactly. November 2023. Binance pleaded guilty, paid over $4 billion for sanctions violations, partly because they failed to keep an effective AML program. They apparently facilitated over $500 million in transactions with Iranian virtual asset exchanges. It really shows how even big, seemingly legitimate VASPs can be exploited if compliance isn't tight.
And the virtual assets themselves are used to move illicit funds,
Yeah.
right? Leveraging the anonymity and speed.
Definitely. We've seen various cases. The Ukraine FIU found suspicious fund movements between crypto exchanges, including a sanctioned Russian VASP using the Tron blockchain to hide the origin. And in the U.S., OFAC designated crypto mixers like Sinbad.io specifically for laundering millions stolen by DPRK hacking groups from Big Heist, Horizon Bridge, Axie Infinity.
And we have to circle back to those DPRK IT workers again. That's a huge revenue source, often paid in crypto.
Yes, thousands of these highly skilled DPRK workers are sent globally, taking freelance jobs using stolen identities. And virtual assets are often the preferred discrete payment method. In the U.S., the DOJ disrupted one of these schemes in August 2024. They charged a U.S. national who was running a laptop farm, basically letting DPRK workers use stolen U.S. identities to do remote work for U.S. companies, generated hundreds of thousands in illicit cash. It's like a digitally enabled human trafficking scheme funding proliferation.
Wow, the adaptability is just remarkable. Leveraging complex global logistics, too, which leads us nicely into typology 4, exploiting the maritime and shipping sectors.
Yeah, this sector is a prime target. It's complex, it's global, and regulatory controls can be pretty fragmented. One key tactic is literally altering the vessel's identity. They physically tamper with ships, paint over names, use fake flags, mess with the official IMO numbers, all to dodge detection.
Like that Petrol 8 case in Indonesia you mentioned.
Exactly that one. In 2022, this bulk carrier, Petrol 8, already UN sanctioned for hauling illicit DPRK coal, was caught in Indonesian waters. It had been bought from a Japanese firm, and they deliberately messed with its identity, used alias flags, just to try and evade monitoring.
And ship-to-ship transfers must be another big loophole. Moving goods between vessels out at sea.
Oh yeah, that's high risk and very hard to monitor. A Singapore case uncovered someone supplying over 12,000 tons of gas oil to the DPRK using the vessel MT Courageous. It involved ship-to-ship transfers, fake documents. These offshore transfers are almost impossible to track in real time without really good intelligence.
Plus the old trick of just going dark, turning off, or fiddling with the automated identification system the AIS broadcasts.
Yes, DPRK flagged ships do this routinely. They disable or manipulate their AIS transponders to avoid tracking and sanctions. Cambodia, for instance, seized two vessels in early 2024, the MV HJL and MV CNI. Both had either turned off their AIs or broadcast fake positions to hide their illicit DPRK coal shipments. It's low-tech, maybe, but highly effective.
And finally, just outright falsifying documents.
That's pervasive, really, across all sectors involved. They alter transport documents, bills of lading, invoices, and user certificates, sometimes after departure, sometimes just misclassifying the goods entirely. A UAE case in 2021 involved a company faking a bill of lading for dual-use inverters heading to a high-risk country. They falsely listed a nuts trader as the seller. It fundamentally undermines trust in the whole global trade system.
Okay, the sheer range and, frankly, ingenuity of these methods, it really highlights the challenge for authorities. But you're saying there are ways to fight back.
Yes, absolutely. And that brings us nicely to mitigating risks, challenges, and good practices. Because, understanding the problem is only half the battle.
So what does this all mean for us? How do authorities, the private sector, how do they even start to tackle this incredibly complex web? Let's start with detection. Things like suspicious activity reports, SARs, and sanction screening.
Right. Having robust SARs reporting obligations is critical. That needs to be coupled with automated sanctions screening systems that pull in both international and national sanctions lists. Also, public-private partnerships, PPPs, are really important for training, outreach, providing detailed advisories with red flags. France, for instance, successfully used negative news screening combined with bank SARs, prompted by a specific call for vigilance from their FIU to spot illicit purchases of dual-use goods heading to a Russian entity.
But there are still significant challenges there, aren't there? It's not perfect.
No. Definitely not. A major hurdle is that nearly a third of countries don't even report SARs specifically for PF, partly because proliferation financing isn't actually criminalized everywhere. Then there's the practical issue of high false positive matches and sanctions screening systems that can just overwhelm compliance teams. Plus, you have many designated non-financial businesses and professions, think real estate agents, lawyers, jewelers handling big sums, who often have a pretty low understanding or compliance level, and they rarely get feedback on the SARs they do file.
Okay, so beyond SARs, what other detection methods are key?
Well, interagency coordination is vital. Law enforcement agencies doing investigations, sharing intelligence, running joint operations. For example, Canada's FIU, FinTrack, got disclosures from SARS about an electronics company suspected of shipping dual-use circuits to Russia. That intelligence then kicked off a new investigation, which uncovered subjects and networks they didn't even know about before.
And that kind of close collaboration has to extend internationally, too, right?
Yeah.
Given how global these threats are.
Oh, absolutely essential. Intelligence sharing, information sharing, especially through global bodies like the Egmont Group for Financial Intelligence Units, it's crucial. For instance, the Canadian FIU got a spontaneous tip-off from another FIU about 90 suspicious wire transfers, like $2.5 million worth, involving entities sanctioned for illicit procurement for Russia's defense sector. These networks are inherently cross-border.
Okay, let's shift to investigation and prosecution. The report notes that even with stronger laws, actual effective cases seem, well, scarce. What are the big challenges there?
Yeah, PF investigations are just different from your typical money laundering or terror financing cases. They often rely more heavily on intelligence, they can involve perfectly legal goods being used for illegal purposes, and frequently they're state-sponsored. This complexity, combined with often a lack of awareness, not enough resources, plus cross-border legal issues like what evidence is admissible, or differences in dual criminality requirements, creates huge hurdles. And, diplomatic immunity can sometimes be a real challenge for investigators, too.
So it's about using a whole toolkit of investigative methods.
Precisely. Standard financial crime procedures are the baseline, obviously, but tracking virtual assets using blockchain analysis, increasingly critical. Advanced analytics, like link analysis, real-time monitoring these are essential for finding those hidden patterns and networks. Some countries are even adapting tactics usually used against organized crime or drug trafficking using undercover agents, confidential informants. There's a powerful example from the U.S. DOJ DEA in February 2024, a defendant charged with trying to traffic nuclear materials, uranium, weapons-grade plutonium after showing samples to an undercover DEA agent posing as a buyer. It just shows how deep authorities sometimes need to go.
This really highlights that constant need for adaptation, for collaboration. Knowledge is power, sure, but shared knowledge seems way more potent in this fight.
That really is the core message here. It just underscores the importance of continuous vigilance, fostering much greater transparency across the board, and making sure information flows seamlessly across borders, across different sectors.
Ultimately, this deep dive, I think, shows us that being well-informed isn't just, an academic thing. It's actually a vital part of protecting our global financial system and, by extension, global security itself. The schemes these actors use are incredibly complex, yeah, but recognizing the patterns, that has to be the critical first step in disrupting them.
And given how relentlessly these illicit actors adapt, how they leverage every single vulnerability they can possibly find, the crucial question for you, the listener, and really for all of us becomes, what vulnerabilities are you noticing right now that might be their next target? What unexpected blind spots are we collectively missing?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. This has been another deep dive from the Riffle, brought to you by 10 Leaves. Until next time, stay curious and keep diving deep.